They're family, Dad. Get over it. The words echoed in Dave's head as he tried to process what had just happened to him. The words hit him like a tidal wave, and coming from someone who came second to none to him, hurt more than he could have ever imagined. His daughter stared unblinkingly at his shrunken figure, seemingly unfazed at her father's reaction to her words. Dave's mind was racing. Everyone in his family knew how he felt about his brother and what his ultimatums were. How could his daughter do this to him? Hours after his daughter had left his house, Dave Richards sat at his porch window, staring wordlessly as he tried to collect his thoughts. Never had he thought he would be contemplating missing his only daughter's wedding, but here he was. And Dave felt like he had no choice left. Seeing his brother would simply be too painful. Was he being irrational? Dave had tried his entire life to suppress the memories of the painful incident that had forced him to alienate himself from his brother. But in an effort to understand his daughter's actions, he brought himself to revisit the incident that tore their family in half. It was 27 years ago. Yes, 27 years was a long time, but the wound was still fresh. A new city, a new family, and a new job were not enough to erase the day he lost both his first love and his brother in a swift blow. 19 years old, wildly in love with his high school sweetheart, and excited to enter college, the last thing Dave expected at that moment in time was to see the girl he loved sitting on the couch of his family home. It wasn't odd to see here, but the scene as a whole made his blood run cold. She was perched at the edge anxiously and unable to meet his eyes, holding on to the hand of his 21-year-old brother. The latter showed a lot less remorse, both physically and verbally. "We've been seeing each other for 4 months now. She says she loves me and doesn't know how to tell you. Sorry, little bro." The nonchalance in Dave's brother's tone drove him to insanity even 27 years later. This was the girl Dave had loved and cared for unconditionally for 4 years of his life, and Ralph had stolen her without any concern for what he would be doing to his little brother. Weeks of conflict and discomfort followed in the Richards household, with Ralph and Lara now openly dating despite Dave being unable to get rid of the dull ache in his heart. He was desperate for an escape. College couldn't come quick enough. Dave moved into his college dorm the moment the opportunity arose. He immersed himself in the work that came with the change of scenery. His goal was to forget how his entire family had failed to protect him from the most significant pain his young soul had ever faced up to that point in his life. Dave eventually started to heal away from home, pursuing the career of his dreams and finding love once again. This wasn't easy. It took him 4 years to even consider a serious relationship after his initial heartbreak. He did, however, send a clear message to his family back home. If Ralph and Lara, who were now married, were to ever be at a family event, Dave sent his commiserations. Still, he would not attend the event at any cost. The decision was initially met with a lot of backlash. However, his unwillingness to budge from his stance was eventually met with acceptance, and Dave was always informed of whether or not his brother would be present at an event before he attended it. While he was sometimes snubbed in favor of his charismatic older brother, it wasn't often that Dave found himself having to abstain from attending events of that nature. Despite his family finding his actions dramatic and unnecessary at first, it was challenging to stay on the side of a brother who unabashedly ruined the happiness of his own blood. 27 years later, and the conditions still stood. David graduated, married his second love, had his beautiful daughter, moved cities, separated from his now ex-wife, and sent his daughter off to college. But his growth was stunted when it came to forgiving and forgetting that fateful day. Never did he think that his daughter would sit him down and tell him the unimaginable. She wanted Ralph and Lara at her wedding, and she wouldn't sway on her decision. "I've kept in touch with them for the last 4 years, and they genuinely seem like lovely people, Dad. Lara says she's truly sorry about what she did to you, and she was so excited that I'd invite them to my wedding." Dave responded with silence, and Sarah unfalteringly continued. "I know you've had your differences, but it's been 27 years, Dad. I'm sure Uncle Ralph would love to see you as well." Dave scoffed. "Has Uncle Ralph said anything to suggest that?" Lara responded with an uncomfortable laugh. "You know him, Dad. He acts all confident and pretends it doesn't bother him, but I'm sure he feels bad for what he did." Dave knew his brother well enough to know he still felt no remorse for what he had done. 27 years and no attempt to reconcile. Actions spoke louder than words, and his actions made it clear where he stood. Hours after Sarah left, Dave's mind was turbulent. This was his daughter. He dreamt of one day walking her down the aisle, giving her away and seeing her make the most beautiful bride. He would be giving all of this up because of his brother. His blood boiled at the thought. Hadn't he lost enough because of his brother's selfishness? However, after hours of pondering, he had made his decision. His ultimatum stood. Either she wanted him at his wedding or his brother, and if she stuck to her guns, he would have to withdraw all support for her special day. He was initially paying for half of the wedding, as Sarah's mother wasn't in a position to contribute financially to her big day, and it was customary in their culture for the bride and groom's family to share the financial responsibility of the proceedings. However, the thought of paying for an event that someone who had hurt him relentlessly could enjoy while he missed out felt unbearably cruel. He had made up his mind. All that was left was breaking it to Sarah. The conversation with Sarah did not go well. He realized she had underestimated the extent to which Dave's hatred for his brother ran, and as a consequence, she was losing out on his support, both financially and otherwise, for the day. "You're being ridiculous, Dad! You can't seriously mean that! This is my wedding! I'm your daughter!" Dave almost faltered. He dreamt of this day, but he knew that if he didn't put his foot down here, there was no way she'd ever respect his boundaries again. It wouldn't stop there. All his other family at the wedding would assume reconciliation was on the horizon when they saw his brother at his daughter's wedding. He would be forced into close proximity to him more often than he thought he could bear. "I've made it clear, Sarah. It's me or him. And if I go, I take my money with me." Sarah was visibly upset, her voice cracking as she tried to compose herself. "This is my big day, Dad. Why are you making this all about you?" "I won't be there, so I can guarantee it will be all about you." Sarah left in tears, and Dave tried to regain composure but failed miserably as he felt tears of his own run down his face. He'd stuck to his guns, but at what cost? It didn't take long for the rage to start firing at him from all sides. The groom's family was first, questioning his integrity for bailing on his daughter's big day over what they called a severe case of an inflated ego. Dave knew it was anything but, and tried to make them understand, to no avail. His ex-wife was next. Despite being unable to contribute financially, she was fully involved in helping Sarah prepare for her big day. When she heard the news that Dave was withdrawing his support, she didn't hold back in expressing how pathetic and hopeless she thought Dave was. The calls were never ending, with her hoping that her relentless nagging would wear Dave down. While Dave sometimes felt himself waver, the anguish he felt 27 years ago would come rushing back to him and help him regain confidence in his stance. He knew what he was doing. He was proud of himself for being able to stand his ground. However, as the months passed with more news of wedding preparations and no news of a retraction of his brother's invitation, he had to admit it hurt greatly. He heard that his daughter was going to be asking her mother to walk her down the aisle in his absence, and that her mother's new husband would be taking out a loan to help fund his portion of the wedding. A significant part of him constantly hoped that his daughter would change her mind and uninvite his brother so he would attend. Dave was driven insane by the thought that, once again, his brother had won. He couldn't help but think about how her choice reflected who she'd rather have at her wedding, and subsequently, who she cared for more. She'd known Ralph for 4 years and him all her life. Why did he take precedence? Dave did know, though, at the back of his mind, that his daughter was punishing him because she saw his refusal to give in as stubbornness. In her mind, she thought that if she didn't change her mind, Dave would eventually take her threat seriously and decide to attend. She'd then get to celebrate her wedding with both her father and her uncle. It would be a win-win situation for her. On the other hand, if she uninvited Ralph to ensure her father was there was no chance of seeing his family on her big day. To her, it wasn't a choice between her father and uncle. It was a choice between having just one of them or both of them. Dave knew differently, though. His mind wasn't going to change regardless of how firm his daughter was in her decision. Weeks passed by and the wedding day was fast approaching, and all the while, Dave's mind came more to terms with missing it while his daughter grew more and more worried. Was he really not going to come back? Sarah started to worry. She hadn't thought this through as much as she had believed. To her, it was inevitable that, eventually, her father would come back around. However, she heard that he was planning on making a business trip the week of her wedding. Does this mean he was holding out until the very end? Deciding to set her pride aside, Sarah approached her father once again. It was no longer about the money. Sarah loved her father unconditionally and couldn't imagine celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life without him by her side. Sitting herself down at her father's familiar old table in her childhood home, she watched as his figure bustled around the kitchen, seemingly uncaring, preparing coffee for them to sip on while they talked. Was he truly that unbothered about missing her wedding? Her thoughts could not be further from the truth. All Dave could think about while he poured their coffee was what Sarah could possibly want from the meeting with him. Surely she wasn't coming to tell him that she was sticking to her decision. He already knew that. Was the only other possibility that she'd decided she wouldn't take the risk of not having him at her wedding and finally cave? He tried to act nonchalant, but his shaking hands as he set down the tray of coffee in front of his daughter gave away his nerves. Sitting down, Dave stared at Sarah expectantly as she nervously took a sip of her coffee. A heavy silence clouded the room as both father and daughter dwelled upon what to say, uncertain how to approach the subject. They both wanted the same thing, Dave at Sarah's wedding, giving her away and celebrating the day of love and happiness. Dave couldn't believe his brother had once again managed to get in the way of him and someone he loved. Before he could say anything, Sarah broke the silence. "Have you not changed your mind yet?" Dave smiled uncomfortably. "As long as your decision stays the same, so does mine, Sarah. I've made that clear." Sarah sighed heavily. "Have you heard about the change in my plans? Mom is walking me down the aisle now." "I heard." "Doesn't that make you worry? The wedding is moving on without you, Dad." "I'm well aware, Sarah, and there's nothing I can do about that." Sarah could tell her father was unshakable in his stance. His demeanor was similar to when she would ask for permission to go out for a party on a school night while she was in high school. She would get on her knees and plead, crying about how unfair he was being. Her father was a firm man. No amount of begging or pleading was going to change his mind. "What did he do that was so awful, Dad?" "You already know, Sarah." "Isn't this all a bit dramatic?" Sarah made a last-ditch effort at making her father sway. Dave paused before answering. "You love Michael, don't you? Imagine someone you loved, someone you trusted, took him away. Someone who saw how much you loved him and how much he meant to you. Would you ever be able to forgive them?" "It would hurt, but it's been 27 years, Dad." Dave laughed. This was what everyone said to him when they heard of his refusal to talk to his brother. To him, the argument made no sense. 27 years don't change the fact that he showed no concern or remorse for me in all that time. In fact, it only makes it worse. 27 years, almost 3 decades, and he hasn't even made an attempt to reach out to me to apologize. He's undeniably the one at fault from the initial incident, wouldn't you agree? Sarah nodded. Doesn't that only make what he did worse with the years? The sheer lack of effort from his end hasn't helped me heal in any way, only made it even more clear to me that he couldn't care less about how I was feeling. Sarah paused. She hadn't thought of it that way. Her father was hurting. This whole time she'd only been thinking about what she wanted for her wedding. She'd forgotten to think about the one person who had supported her unconditionally for her 20 years of life would want. As much as the wedding was about her, it was also about celebrating the person she'd grown into and the person she would be entering her new phase of life as. Disrespecting the person who gave her everything she needed to become the person she wanted to be as an adult was the last thing she had imagined she'd be doing at her wedding. Yet here she was, sitting before the man she owed her life to, refusing to accept that his feelings were valid. Before she knew it, her eyes had filled with tears and she was launching herself into her father's arms. "I'm sorry." The day was here. Sarah had dreamed of an outdoor wedding, but was told to avoid it because of unpredictable weather. However, the sun shone brightly on the decorated garden of a beautiful summer house, butterflies fluttering around the arch of flowers that stood tall in front of the rows of chairs full of Sarah and Michael's loved ones. Michael walked down the aisle with his parents, beaming in joy as he took his place at the altar and looked back down the aisle. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Sarah came into view, her bright smile befitting the occasion. As she walked down the aisle, she took a moment to stop and smile at the person beside her. Dave couldn't contain his happiness. His daughter was practically glowing, and being able to witness her venture into this new phase of her life was all he had ever wanted. Once they reached the altar, Sarah leaned in for a hug and whispered, still beaming with happiness, "I'm so glad you're here." Dave took his seat at the front of the crowd, and Sarah took her place at the altar. The ceremony began, and all Dave could see was Sarah, her happiness palpable as the couple went through their vows. The ceremony went perfectly, and nothing could dim the joy that everyone at the reception radiated. Dave couldn't believe how happy he was. Just a month ago, he was prepared to miss this day because of his brother, alienating himself from someone he loved because of Ralph's selfishness for what wouldn't be the first time. Sarah couldn't believe herself either. Not one moment did she regret the fact that her father's brother wasn't there, but her delight she received from seeing her father flitting amongst the guests was indescribable. She sighed heavily in relief as she realized what a bullet she'd dodged. Dave's heart was lighter than it had been in months watching his daughter. Their smiles reflected in each other's faces as their eyes met, and they walked towards each other. "Thank you for coming, Dad." "Thank you for having me, Sarah."